What you are looking at is the Ashworth estate, a world built by billions of dollars, where every comfort is attainable and every problem has a price tag. But for 2 long years, this palace was a prison for 20-year-old Leo Ashworth. After a horrific accident, the finest doctors in the world with their cutting-edge treatments and million-dollar invoices all delivered the same verdict: he would never walk again. His family saw him as a tragic fixture in their perfect lives. The staff saw him as a burden. But there was one person they didn't see at all: the quiet maid who cleaned his room. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, and they were about to discover that the person they ignored was the only one who held the key to changing his life forever. The Ashworth Mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, wasn't a home. It was a statement. Each of its 27 rooms was a testament to the immense wealth of Richard Ashworth, a man who had carved a formidable empire out of corporate acquisitions. His wife, Catherine, was the curator of this perfection. She managed the estate with the same ruthless efficiency her husband managed his boardroom, ensuring every surface gleamed, every flower arrangement was fresh, and every imperfection was swiftly and silently removed. Their son Leo was the one imperfection they couldn't remove. For 2 years since the night his silver sports car had become a mangled wreck on a rain-slicked road, Leo had been confined to a wheelchair. The crash had shattered his spine, but it had also shattered his spirit. At 20, he should have been conquering the world, following in his father's footsteps at Wharton. Instead, he was a prisoner in his own body, his days dictated by a schedule of nurses, physical therapists, and the suffocating silence of his lavish bedroom. His parents loved him, but in their own detached Ashworth way. His father Richard expressed his love through checks funding experimental treatments in Switzerland, hiring the best medical minds money could buy. Dr. Alistair Finch, a man with a chiseled jaw and a price tag to match, was the latest in a long line of physical therapists. He would arrive twice a week in a pristine suit, put Leo through a series of painful, humiliating exercises, and leave after delivering a grimly optimistic report to Catherine that was all style and no substance. "We're seeing minor improvements in muscle response," he'd say, a phrase that had become meaningless. Catherine's love was a performance of concern. She would float into Leo's room dressed for a charity luncheon and ask if he was comfortable. She'd fluff his pillows, check that his meals were to his liking, and talk about the latest society gossip, carefully avoiding the one topic that hung in the air like a shroud: his future. For Catherine, Leo's condition was a social inconvenience, a tragedy that marred the flawless portrait of their family. Leo had become an expert in bitterness. His wit, once a charming asset, was now a weapon he used to keep everyone at a distance. He'd mock the nurses, dismiss Dr. Finch's efforts with a sarcastic drawl, and meet his mother's superficial kindness with a wall of cynical silence. He saw the pity in their eyes, the discomfort, and he hated them for it. He felt like one of his mother's porcelain vases, incredibly expensive, exquisitely cared for, and utterly lifeless. Into this cold, sterile world walked Sarah Jenkins. She was in her late 40s, a woman from Jamaica, whose quiet dignity was her most prominent feature. She was one of several staff members, but she occupied the lowest rung. She wasn't the head housekeeper or the chef. She was one of the maids assigned to the upstairs bedrooms, including Leo's sprawling suite. To the Ashworths, Sarah was invisible. She was a uniform, a pair of hands that made beds and emptied trash cans. They never spoke to her, directly passing instructions through the head housekeeper. When she was in a room, they would look past her, as if she were a piece of furniture. Sarah, in turn, was a model of discretion. She moved through the grand halls like a ghost, her presence marked only by the scent of lemon polish and the pristine order she left in her wake. But Sarah saw everything. She saw the way Leo's hands clenched on the arms of his wheelchair when Dr. Finch forced his unresponsive legs into another excruciating stretch. She saw the flicker of raw despair in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She saw the untouched trays of gourmet food left outside his door. She saw a young man drowning in a sea of wealth utterly alone. Unlike the others, Sarah didn't see a tragedy or an inconvenience. She saw a boy trapped by pain, and it stirred something deep within her. Back in her small town of Montego Bay, she had been more than a maid. She had been a community caregiver, learning traditional methods of healing from her grandmother, a woman known throughout the parish for her healing hands. She had worked as a nurse's aide for years, her dream of becoming a full-fledged physical therapist dashed by the need to come to America to send money back home for her ailing mother and her son's education. Her qualifications meant nothing here. So she cleaned houses, her vast knowledge of the human body and its capacity for healing locked away unused. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Finch finished his session with Leo. "Excellent work today, Leo," he said, with his usual empty cheerfulness. "We're building that muscle memory." Leo just stared out the window, his jaw tight. "Right. Remind me again what my muscles are supposed to be remembering." Dr. Finch's smile faltered for a second before he clapped his hands together. "All in good time. I'll see your mother on the way out." As the door clicked shut, Leo let out a long, ragged breath and slammed his fist against the arm of his chair. A book he'd been trying to read toppled off his lap and slid under the edge of the bed, just out of his reach. He grunted in frustration, his attempt to retrieve it only highlighting his helplessness. He was about to yell for a nurse when the door opened silently. It was Sarah Jenkins there to turn down his bed for the evening. She saw the book, saw the flush of anger and shame on Leo's face. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over, picked up the book, a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea, and placed it gently back on his lap. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. There was no pity in them. There was only a quiet, profound understanding. "Thank you," Leo mumbled, caught off guard. It was the first time he had ever spoken directly to her. Sarah simply nodded, a faint, sad smile gracing her lips. "Even Santiago needed the boy, Mr. Leo," she said, her voice soft with a lilting Jamaican accent. Then, as quietly as she had entered, she went about her duties and left. Leo sat stunned. She hadn't just picked up his book. She knew what he was reading. And in one simple sentence, she had understood his struggle more than anyone in this house had in 2 years. For the first time since the accident in the oppressive silence of his gilded cage, Leo Ashworth felt something other than despair. He felt a flicker of curiosity. The brief exchange lingered in Leo's mind. It was nothing a fleeting moment, yet it stood in stark contrast to the scripted interactions that defined his life. Even Santiago needed the boy. She hadn't pitied him. She had acknowledged his struggle, his fight. For the rest of the day, Leo found himself watching for her. He noticed the way she moved with an economy of motion that spoke of quiet strength. He noticed she never hummed mindless tunes like the other staff. Sometimes he'd catch the whisper of a soulful melody, a sound that was both sad and resilient. A few days later, another moment broke the monotony. A nurse had clumsily helped him transfer from his chair to his bed, leaving his left leg at an awkward angle that sent a sharp, spasming pain up his thigh. He gritted his teeth, waiting for it to pass when Sarah entered, to collect his lunch tray. She saw him wince, her eyes immediately drawn to the unnatural position of his leg. Without a word of permission, she stepped forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Leo," she said softly. Her hands, surprisingly strong and warm, gently cupped his calf and ankle. She didn't just move his leg. She repositioned it with a practiced, intuitive touch, slightly rotating his hip and propping a small pillow under his knee. The relief was instantaneous. The spasming subsided into a dull ache. "How did you do that?" Leo asked, his voice rough with surprise. Sarah straightened up her professional mask, slipping back into place. "My grandmother, she had bad arthritis. She taught me that sometimes the pain is not where the problem is. The whole body is connected. My doctors connect me to machines that cost more than your house." Leo shot back, his habitual sarcasm returning. Sarah wasn't offended. She met his gaze with a steady calm. "A machine can read the body, sir, but it cannot listen to it." She picked up the tray and turned to leave. "Wait." Leo said the word, coming out louder than he intended. "What's your name?" "Sarah, sir. Sarah Jenkins." After that, a silent routine began to form. When Sarah came to clean his room, Leo would make sure he was alone. He started asking her questions first about her life in Jamaica, then, more hesitantly, about her grandmother. He learned she grew up in a place where the nearest doctor was miles away, where people relied on folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and a deep understanding of the body passed down through generations. Sarah spoke of listening to muscles of understanding, how fear and despair could make the body hold on to trauma, refusing to let go. "The mind tells the legs to give up," she explained one afternoon while dusting his bookshelves. "And the legs, they obey. You have to convince the mind first. You have to give it a reason to hope." This was a language Leo had never heard. Dr. Finch spoke of nerve pathways, atrophy and statistical probabilities. His parents spoke of new treatments and second opinions. No one had ever spoken about hope. One evening, emboldened by their quiet conversations, Leo confessed his deepest frustration. "Finch has me doing these leg lifts with electrical stimulation. I feel the muscle jump, but it's not me doing it. It's the machine. It feels like a lie." Sarah paused in her work, her brow furrowed in thought. "Mr. Leo," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Tonight before you sleep, can you try something for me? Do not try to move your whole leg. That is too much. It is like trying to shout when you have lost your voice. Instead, just try to whisper. Pick one toe, your big toe, and just think about wiggling it. Do not force it. Just send the thought down, like a gentle message. See if it arrives." It sounded absurd, a childish exercise in visualization. But that night, lying in the dark, surrounded by the oppressive silence of the mansion, Leo tried it. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world, and focused all his energy, all his will on a single point, the big toe on his right foot. He pictured the nerve pathways Dr. Finch was always talking about, but he imagined them not as cold, clinical wires, but as a warm stream of light flowing from his mind, down his spine, down his leg, to that single, stubborn destination. He did it for almost an hour, frustration mounting until he was about to give up. And then he felt it. It wasn't a movement. It was less than that. It was a flicker. A tiny, infinitesimal tremor, deep inside his foot, a spark in the darkness. He gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried again, focusing with an intensity that left him trembling. And there it was again. A phantom twitch, a neurological whisper. It was the first time in 2 years that a signal sent from his brain had been answered by his lower body. The next morning when Sarah came in, Leo was buzzing with a nervous energy she hadn't seen before. I felt something, he said, his voice cracking. Your toe thing, I felt it. For the first time, Sarah allowed a wide, brilliant smile to light up her face. It transformed her, chasing away the tired lines around her eyes. "Good," she said, her voice rich with pride. "The message has arrived. Now we must teach it how to speak." That day marked a profound shift. The dynamic between them was no longer just about quiet conversations and small kindnesses. A fragile secret alliance had been forged. They were a team, and for the first time since the crash, the suffocating despair that had defined Leo's existence began to recede, replaced by a terrifying, thrilling whisper of hope. The flicker in Leo's toe was the spark that lit a clandestine fire. Their secret sessions began in earnest, conducted in the hushed hours of the late afternoon, when Catherine was at her club meetings and Richard was still at the office. The official nursing staff had a shift change at 3 p.m., leaving a precious 90-minute window before the evening nurse arrived. This became their sacred time. Sarah would enter Leo's room, not with a duster and polish, but with a quiet determination in her eyes. "Let us begin, Mr. Leo," she would say, and the vast, opulent bedroom would transform into a sanctuary of healing. Her methods were a world away from Dr. Finch's cold clinical regimen. He relied on machines and measurements. Sarah relied on instinct, touch, and memory. She started with his hands. "The paralysis is in your legs, but the despair is in your whole body," she explained gently, kneading the tense, knotted muscles of his forearms and palms. "We must remind every part of you what it feels like to be alive." She brought things from her own small apartment. Smooth, warm stones from a river which she would place on key points along his legs to stimulate blood flow. She made a poultice from ginger and herbs, the spicy, earthy scent filling the sterile room. She explained that its warmth would help wake up the sleeping nerves. Leo, who had been subjected to the most advanced cryotherapy and laser treatments, found it almost laughable. Yet he couldn't deny the deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to soothe an ache he didn't even know he had. Music became a central part of their therapy. Sarah would play soft reggae and gospel music from her phone. Bob Marley toots, and the maytales and the soaring voices of a Jamaican church choir. "This is healing music," she told him. "It has a rhythm, a heartbeat. Your body remembers rhythm." She would tap out a beat on his knees, encouraging him to feel the vibration, to connect with it. They worked on the floor, a place Leo hadn't been since before the accident. Getting him there was an undignified, laborious process, but Sarah was surprisingly strong. Lying on a thick mat, she would guide him through movements that were part physical therapy, part yoga, part something entirely her own. She wouldn't just tell him to engage his core. She would place her hand on his abdomen and say, "Find your center. This is your anchor. Everything starts from here." She taught him to breathe. It seemed so basic, yet he realized he had been holding his breath for 2 years, living in a state of constant shallow tension. Sarah taught him to take long, deep breaths that filled his lungs and sent oxygen surging through his system. "Breathe in strength," she'd murmur, guiding his legs through gentle stretches. "Breathe out the fear." Progress was agonizingly slow, measured in millimeters. The toe flicker became a conscious twitch. The twitch, after weeks of relentless focus, became a clumsy wiggle. One afternoon, while concentrating so hard that sweat beaded on his forehead, Leo managed to flex his entire foot upwards. It was a small, jerky movement, but it was his. He let out a raw, triumphant shout, a sound of pure joy that echoed in the silent mansion. Sarah simply squeezed his shoulder, her eyes shining. "See, the voice is getting louder." Their bond deepened with every secret session. Leo found himself telling her things he had never told anyone about the fight he'd had with his father, the night of the crash about his terror of being a lifelong burden about his lost dreams. Sarah, in turn, shared stories of her son in Jamaica, a bright young man studying engineering, the reason she worked 3 jobs and sent every spare dollar home. She never complained. Her resilience was a quiet force that humbled and inspired him. He began to see the world through her eyes. He noticed the casual, thoughtless ways his parents treated the staff. He heard the dismissive tone his mother used, the way his father ignored their presence entirely. These were people with lives, with families, with dreams of their own, yet in this house they were invisible. Just as he had been invisible, trapped behind the label of invalid. The physical changes were mirrored by a transformation in his demeanor. The bitter sarcasm softened. The wall of cynical silence began to crumble. He started engaging with the nurses, asking their names. He ate the food that was brought to him. The fire was returning to his eyes, but it was no longer the fire of rage. It was the fire of determination. One afternoon they were working on strengthening his upper body with Leo on the floor, pushing himself up from his stomach. It was a grueling task. His arms shook and he collapsed several times, frustrated. "I can't," he gasped, his face pressed against the plush carpet. "You can," Sarah said, firmly kneeling beside him. "The strength is there. You just don't trust it. Now, listen to the music. Feel the beat. Push on the beat. 1, 2, 3. Push!" He channeled all his frustration, all his hope into one final effort. With a guttural yell, he pushed himself up his arms, locking his back straight. He was holding his own weight. Below him, he felt a strange new sensation. The muscles in his thighs and glutes, dormant for so long, were contracting, trying to help. They were firing. It was in that moment, suspended between the floor and failure, that Leo Ashworth knew with absolute certainty that he was going to walk again. And the woman who would get him there wasn't the world-renowned specialist, but the quiet maid everyone else ignored. The secret, however, was becoming too big to hide. His progress was undeniable. His legs had more tone, his color was better, and his newfound optimism was palpable. The evening nurse noticed it. Dr. Finch, during his bi-weekly visits, was baffled. "Incredible," Dr. Finch commented one day, manipulating Leo's leg. "The passive resistance is much stronger. Whatever that new Swiss serum is doing, it's finally kicking in." Leo just smiled, a secret, knowing smile. He and Sarah had a silent agreement. They would wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. But in a house built on secrets and appearances, the truth has a way of exploding into the light. And that explosion was coming sooner than they could have ever imagined. The right moment never came. Instead, the truth was ripped out into the open on a cold, grey Thursday. Richard and Catherine Ashworth had been planning a major charity gala for weeks. It was the social event of the season, and Catherine had been consumed by every detail from the floral arrangements to the seating chart. That particular afternoon, she had returned home early from a meeting, a rare occurrence. The caterer had sent over the wrong champagne flutes, a cardinal sin in her world, and she was storming through the house phone, pressed to her ear, speaking in sharp, clipped tones. Upstairs in Leo's suite, the secret session was in full swing. They had achieved a monumental breakthrough, with Sarah supporting his hips and Leo gripping 2 sturdy bedposts. He was standing. His legs were shaking violently, bathed in sweat, and every muscle screamed in protest, but he was standing on his own 2 feet for the first time in over 2 years. A triumphant, tearful grin was stretched across his face. "I'm doing it, Sarah," he gasped, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm standing." Sarah's face was a mask of intense concentration and pure joy. "I know, Mr. Leo, I know. Hold it. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Remember this feeling." That was the scene Catherine Ashworth walked in on. She ended her call, pushed open her son's door without knocking, and froze. The sight before her was incomprehensible. Her son, the boy whom world-class doctors had condemned to a life in a chair, was on his feet, and holding him up was not a nurse or a therapist, but the maid, Sarah Jenkins. The maid was on the expensive Persian rug, her uniform slightly dishevelled her hands firmly on her son's body. For a moment there was just stunned silence. The air crackled with tension. Leo's grin vanished, replaced by a look of panic. The sudden shock caused his concentration to break. His legs buckled. "Leo!" Catherine shrieked, rushing forward. Sarah, with a strength belying her frame, managed to guide his fall, preventing him from crashing to the floor, and instead lowering him into a heap against the bed. Catherine ignored her son. Her eyes, cold and furious, were locked on Sarah. "What is the meaning of this?" She hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "What do you think you are doing? Get your hands off my son." Sarah rose to her feet, her dignity a shield against Catherine's venom. "Mom, we were just—" "I know what you were doing." Catherine's voice rose, laced with a mix of horror and accusation. She saw a lowly servant performing some kind of strange, unqualified procedure on her vulnerable son. "You are a maid. You clean floors. Are you insane? You could have hurt him. You could have paralyzed him permanently." "No, Mum, you don't understand," Leo said from the floor, trying to catch his breath. "She's been helping me. She's the reason I can feel my legs again." Catherine whirled on him. "Don't be ridiculous, Leo. This is the work of Dr. Finch and the treatments. She was probably taking advantage of you filling your head with nonsense." She turned back to Sarah, her finger pointing like a dagger. "You're fired. Get out. Pack your things and get out of my house. Immediately. I'll have security escort you out." "No!" The word erupted from Leo, raw and powerful. Using the bed for support, he started to pull himself up. "You can't fire her." "Watch me!" Catherine spat. "This is my house, and she is my employee." "She is my friend," Leo yelled back, his arms shaking with the effort of trying to rise. "She has done more for me in 2 months than all of your expensive doctors have done in 2 years." I stood up, Mum. "Did you see that? For the first time I stood up, and it was because of her." The sheer passion in Leo's voice finally pierced Catherine's armor of indignation. She stared at her son, truly stared at him, and saw a fire in him she thought had been extinguished forever. He wasn't the broken, bitter boy who stared out the window. He was a fighter. Just then, Richard Ashworth walked in, drawn by the shouting. "What in God's name is going on in here?" He boomed, his presence filling the room. He took in the scene, his wife pale with rage, his son on the floor struggling to get up, and the maid standing silently in the center of the storm. Catherine quickly explained, painting Sarah as a reckless, dangerous charlatan. She was performing some kind of voodoo on him. "Richard. She needs to be removed." Richard's gaze fell on Sarah, his eyes cold and assessing. He was a man who understood liability, and this situation screamed of it. "Is this true?" he asked Sarah, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Have you been treating my son without a license?" Before Sarah could answer, Leo found his voice, again, this time clear and steady. "She has been healing me, Dad. When everyone else gave up, she didn't." He finally managed to pull himself into a sitting position on the floor, his chest heaving. "If she goes, I go." The threat was absurd. Where would he go? But the ultimatum hung in the air, a shocking act of defiance. Richard and Catherine stared at their son, who was looking at Sarah with an expression of fierce loyalty. They were confronted with an undeniable paradox. Their son was getting better, demonstrably better, and the catalyst was the one person in their world they considered a nobody. Richard, ever the pragmatist, saw the situation not just as a liability, but as a result. His son, who had been a shell of a human being, was fighting for something. The numbers didn't add up, but the result was right there in front of him. He held up a hand to silence his wife. He looked from Leo's determined face to Sarah's calm, unwavering expression. The anger in his own face slowly subsided, replaced by a complex mixture of confusion, suspicion, and a sliver of something else, intrigue. "Nobody is going anywhere," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, decisive tone. "Not until I understand exactly what has been going on in this house." He turned his full, formidable attention to Sarah. "You and I are going to have a conversation. Now." The secret was out. The quiet sanctuary of Leo's room had been breached, and the fragile world he and Sarah had built was now under the harsh, unforgiving scrutiny of his parents. The battle had just begun. Richard Ashworth did not conduct conversations. He conducted interrogations. He led Sarah not to the warmth of the family living room, but to his study, a severe mahogany-panelled room that smelled of old leather and power. Catherine and Leo were left behind, the tension between them, a palpable, crackling thing. Leo, with the help of a stunned nurse who had arrived mid-drama, got back into his chair, his mind racing. In the study, Richard sat behind his enormous desk, a king on his throne, and gestured for Sarah to take the small, uncomfortable chair opposite him. For several long moments he simply stared at her, his eyes trained to find weakness, to dissect motives. Sarah met his gaze without flinching, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Let's start from the beginning," Richard said, his voice deceptively soft. "Who are you?" "My name is Sarah Jenkins, sir." "I know your name. I want to know who you are to be practicing medicine on my son. What are your qualifications?" So Sarah told him. She spoke of her years as a nurse's aide in Jamaica, of her informal training under her grandmother, the healer. She described her deep-seated belief in the connection between mind and body, a concept that sounded like utter nonsense in this temple of capitalism. Richard listened, his expression unreadable. "So to be clear," he said when she finished, "you have no formal degree, no license, no certifications recognized in this country." "No, sir," Sarah admitted, "but I have experience, and I have seen results. The results are noted," Richard conceded, steepling his fingers. "But that doesn't change the fact that you put my son and my family in a position of extreme liability if anything had gone wrong." He let the sentence hang in the air. "Why do it? What was your angle? Were you expecting payment? A lawsuit?" He couldn't comprehend an act of pure altruism. In his world, everyone had a motive. "My angle, as you call it, was that I saw a young man in pain, and I knew I could help," Sarah said, a quiet fire entering her voice. "You and your wife, you gave him everything money can buy, but you didn't give him hope. I did." Her words hit a nerve. Richard's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was his private investigator, a man named Peterson he kept on retainer for sensitive corporate and personal matters. He had called Peterson the moment he'd left Leo's room, ordering a full background check on one Sarah Jenkins. The results were in. "Excuse me," Richard said, turning away to read the email that had just arrived. As he scanned the document, his expression shifted from suspicion to stony shock. The report contained the expected details: her birth in Jamaica, her work history, her immigration status. But then it went further back into her family history. And one name jumped off the page: Winston Jenkins. Sarah's father. The investigator's report was chillingly clear. Winston Jenkins had been a factory foreman for 25 years at a textile company called Northwood Mills. 15 years ago, Ashworth Capital had acquired Northwood Mills in a hostile takeover. Richard had orchestrated it himself. As was his standard procedure, he'd streamlined operations for maximum profit. That had meant closing 3 of the older factories, including the one where Winston Jenkins had worked his entire adult life. The report detailed the fallout, the terminated pensions, the thousands of jobs lost, the devastated community. Winston Jenkins, at 52, had lost everything: his job, his savings, his future. The report ended with a clipped factual summary. 2 years after the factory closure, Winston Jenkins had died of a massive heart attack. The family doctor had cited extreme stress as a contributing factor. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Richard Ashworth looked up from his phone, his face pale. He looked at the woman sitting before him, this quiet, dignified maid who had been secretly healing his son. She wasn't just a random employee. She was the daughter of a man whose life, his business practices, had effectively destroyed. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her presence in his house, her focus on his son, was this all some long, elaborate plot for revenge, to gain his trust, his son's trust. And then, what sue them for a fortune, expose him to the press. Your father. Richard said, his voice a low growl. He worked at Northwood Mills. Sarah's composure finally fractured. A flicker of deep old pain crossed her face. Yes, she whispered. He did. You knew, Richard stated, his mind racing through the worst-case scenarios. You knew who I was when you took this job. This has all been a setup. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she held his gaze. I did not know when I first started working for the agency. I only found out this was your house after my first week here. I almost quit. But you didn't. Richard pressed his voice hard as steel. Why stay? Because when I saw your son, Sarah said, her voice trembling with a powerful mix of grief and conviction, I didn't see the son of the man who ruined my family. I saw my father. Richard recoiled as if struck. I saw the same despair in his eyes. She continued, the words pouring out of her now. The same hopelessness. After the factory closed, my father wasted away. He lost his purpose. He felt trapped in a life he couldn't control. Your money, your doctors, they couldn't fix your son's spirit, just like no amount of sympathy could fix my father's broken heart. When I looked at Mr. Leo, I swore I would not let another good man waste away in sadness if there was anything I could do to stop it. The raw, unvarnished truth of her words silenced Richard completely. This wasn't a scheme for money. It was something far more complex, something his cynical mind could barely process. It was an act of profound, almost unbelievable grace. The daughter of the man he had crushed had chosen to save his own son. The weight of it was suffocating. His entire life had been a series of calculated transactions of wins and losses. People were assets or liabilities. But Sarah Jenkins defied categorization. She had every reason to hate him, to wish his family ill. Instead, she had given them the one thing his billions could not buy. The reckoning had arrived, but it wasn't a lawsuit or a scandal. It was a quiet, personal judgment, delivered in his own study by the woman he had wronged. Richard Ashworth, the titan of industry, felt the foundations of his world begin to crack. The true cost of his success was sitting right in front of him, and it had a human face. When Richard emerged from his study, he looked like a man who had aged a decade. The revelation had shaken him to his core. He walked past a waiting Catherine without a word and went straight to Leo's room. Leo was sitting by the window, a storm of anxiety and defiance on his face. He expected a lecture, a final verdict, another argument. Instead, his father pulled up a chair and simply looked at him. "She told me," Richard said, his voice hoarse, "about her father, about Northwood Mills." Leo's eyes widened. He knew the name. It was one of his father's most famous and ruthless acquisitions. He had studied it at school as a prime example of corporate restructuring. Now the abstract case study had a face the face of the woman who had become his lifeline. The implications crashed down on him with suffocating weight. His family's fortune, the very mansion he was sitting in, was built on the ruins of families like Sarah's. Leo started, but he had no words. A profound sense of shame washed over him. He had been so consumed by his own pain, his own gilded cage, that he had never considered the foundations upon which that cage was built. Sarah had been healing the son of the man responsible for her own family's tragedy. The magnitude of her compassion was staggering. "She is an extraordinary woman," Richard said, the admission costing him a visible effort. It was a crack in his armor of pride. That night, the Ashworth mansion was quieter than ever, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of sterility and emotional distance, but the heavy ringing silence that follows a massive explosion. The family's carefully constructed facade had been shattered. The healing that followed was not physical, but moral. It began with Leo. The next morning, he wheeled himself to the staff quarters, a part of the house he had never seen, and found Sarah packing a small suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. "It is for the best, Mr. Leo," she said, not looking at him. "I cannot work here anymore. There is too much history." "No," Leo said, wheeling closer and putting his hand on her arm. "If you leave, you take my hope with you. Please, Sarah, don't go. We're not finished." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "My family owes you a debt. Not just for me, for your father. Let us start to repay it." The rawness of his plea, the acknowledgement of her family's pain, stopped her. She saw in his eyes not the entitled millionaire's son, but a young man grappling with a legacy of pain he had just discovered. She slowly nodded. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of Leo's life. He confronted his father, but not with anger. He came with questions. He wanted to know the story of Northwood Mills not from a business textbook, but from the man who had made the decisions. Richard, for the first time, didn't hide behind jargon like synergy and shareholder value. He spoke of the brutal calculus of his business, of the faceless numbers on a spreadsheet that represented thousands of lives. He didn't make excuses, but he explained his mindset, a detached, relentless drive to win, to build, where the human cost was always a regrettable but necessary footnote. "I never thought about them as people." Richard confessed, his voice heavy with a new kind of weariness. "They were line items, expenses to be cut. It's how I was taught. It's how I succeeded." This new painful honesty began to ripple through the family. Catherine, seeing the profound bond between her son and Sarah and the deep shame in her husband, was forced to confront her own superficiality. Her obsession with appearances, with social standing, seemed utterly hollow in the face of this raw human drama. She had been worried about the wrong champagne flutes, while a quiet miracle born from a deep tragedy was happening under her own roof. The Ashworths began to change. The healing was slow and awkward. Richard made a decision. It wasn't about a simple cash settlement. That would be an insult. He tasked a team of his top lawyers and accountants with a new project to track down as many of the former Northwood Mills employees as possible whose pensions had been wiped out. He began setting up a restoration fund, seeding it with millions of his personal fortune to make them whole. It was a logistical nightmare and a PR risk, but it was a start. He made the first deposit into a trust for Sarah's son's education, enough to cover his university and beyond. Catherine, meanwhile, did something she hadn't done in years. She sat with Leo not to talk about society events, but to listen. She asked about his sessions with Sarah, about what he was feeling, about what he was afraid of. She began to see him not as a broken piece of her perfect life, but as her son, a young man of incredible strength and resilience. She even began speaking to Sarah, asking her about her home, her family, her life. The conversations were stilted at first, but they were a bridge across a chasm of class and privilege. Amidst this familial upheaval, Leo's physical healing accelerated. With the family's full, albeit humbled support, Sarah was no longer a secret. She worked with him openly, her methods now complemented by the best resources the Ashworth money could provide. Richard fired the slick, expensive Dr. Finch, and on Sarah's recommendation, hired a practical, open-minded physical therapist who was astounded by Leo's progress and Sarah's intuitive knowledge. The new therapist worked with Sarah, respecting her insights and integrating them into a formal plan. Leo took his first unaided steps 3 months after the unveiling. It was in the grand foyer on the cold marble floor that had once seemed a universe away. His parents stood by, holding their breath. Sarah was right beside him, her hand hovering near his back. He took one shaky step, then another and another, until he crossed the entire hall, collapsing into his father's arms. It wasn't just a son hugging his father. It was a moment of shared redemption, of a family finding its way back, not just to strength, but to grace. The walking was just the beginning. The real healing, the healing of the Ashworth soul, had just begun. A year later, the Ashworth mansion was fundamentally altered, as if the very soul of the building had been exhaled and replaced with something warmer and more breathable. The oppressive museum-like silence that once amplified every footstep and hushed every conversation was gone. In its place were the unfamiliar sounds of life. Sometimes it was the murmur of a genuine discussion drifting from Richard's study. Other times it was the sound of Catherine's laughter, a sound so rare Leo had almost forgotten its existence. Sunlight, which once seemed only to illuminate the coldness of the marble and the sterility of the decor, now poured through the large windows and seemed to pool in welcoming patches on the floor. The house was no longer a statement of wealth. It was slowly, awkwardly becoming a home. Leo Ashworth was its walking, breathing centerpiece of change. He moved through its halls with a slight, persistent limp, a permanent ghost of the accident, but he no longer saw it as a mark of brokenness. It was a reminder of the cost of ignorance, the price of pride, and the profound strength it took to rebuild. His journey had taught him that true strength wasn't about a flawless physique, but about the will to take the next step, no matter how unsteady. He had abandoned his path to Wharton, the future his father had meticulously mapped out for him. The cold calculus of corporate finance now seemed hollow and meaningless. Instead, he was enrolled at Columbia, majoring in social policy, driven by an insatiable need to understand the systems that created and sustained the kind of disparity that had nearly cost the Jenkins family everything. 3 times a week, he drove himself to a legal aid center in the Bronx, a world away from the manicured lawns of Greenwich. He wasn't there for a photo opportunity. He was there to work. He listened to stories that echoed Sarah's past stories of job losses, pension cuts, and the quiet despair of families pushed to the brink by corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms. He didn't offer pity. He offered a compassionate ear, and helped them navigate the complex paperwork for assistance programs. His work, a small tangible act of penance for a legacy he was determined to reshape. His father was undertaking his own far larger act of penance. Richard Ashworth, the Titan, who once moved markets with a single phone call, now dedicated his days to a different kind of accounting. He had stepped down as CEO of Ashworth Capital, taking on a chairman role that was largely symbolic. His real work took place in small towns and union halls, where he personally oversaw the Northwood Mills Pension Restoration Fund. It was a grueling, humbling process. He met with the families of the men and women his decisions had impacted. He sat in their modest living rooms a world away from his mahogany study and listened to their anger, their grief, and their stories. He offered no excuses, only sincere, difficult apologies, and the restored pensions they were owed. It was the hardest work of his life, and the first work that ever made him feel truly whole. Catherine stood by his side, her own transformation just as profound. The Queen of Society Gallus had abdicated her throne. Her new focus was her family's fractured soul, which she helped mend with quiet, consistent acts of love, ensuring Richard ate when he worked late, sitting with Leo to discuss his day, and most remarkably, forging a genuine friendship with Sarah. Sarah Jenkins was no longer the maid. She was a director. After acing her certification exams funded by a deeply grateful Richard, she had refused his offer of a simple, large check. Instead, she had a vision. With the full backing of the new Ashworth Foundation, she had opened the Jenkins Healing and Wellness Center. It was a beautiful, light-filled space in a neighborhood that had never had access to such quality care. It was the antithesis of a sterile clinic. Plants cascaded from shelves, the scent of ginger and lemongrass hung faintly in the air, and the gentle rhythm of reggae music was a constant, soothing presence. Sarah's practice was a testament to her philosophy, blending her grandmother's wisdom with evidence-based physical therapy. She hired and mentored young therapists, teaching them not just to treat an injury, but to listen to the person. She was a pillar of her community, a respected healer who gave hope back to those who had lost it. One crisp autumn afternoon, Leo visited her there. They walked to a small hill on the property that overlooked a garden where patients were exercising. For a long moment, they stood in comfortable silence watching the scene below. "You know," Leo began, his voice thoughtful, "for the longest time, I believed the accident was the end of my life, that my story was over." Sarah smiled, that familiar, knowing smile that had first given him hope. "It was," she said, her voice soft but certain, "the end of one life. The boy in that gilded cage, he had to be broken so the man you are now could be born." Leo nodded, the truth of her words settling deep in his bones. He looked down at his own 2 feet, planted firmly on the earth. They were scarred, imperfect, but they were his. They had carried him out of the darkness. Sarah had shown him the path, but he had taken the steps. He looked at the remarkable woman beside him, the invisible maid who had seen everything, the daughter of a man his family had wronged, the quiet force of nature, who had not sought revenge, but had offered grace instead. She had not just healed his body. She had healed his entire world. The Ashworth empire of cold, hard cash had been shaken to its foundations, but in the ruins, they had finally discovered something priceless. They had found their humanity, and on that foundation, they could build a future worth walking toward. In the end, Leo Ashworth's journey was not just about learning to walk again. It was about his entire family learning to see. They had been blind to the people who kept their world running and blind to the true cost of their own success. Sarah Jenkins didn't perform a miracle with magic. She performed it with empathy, knowledge, and a strength of character that forced an entire family to confront their own brokenness. Her story is a powerful reminder that true worth is never defined by a job title or a bank account. It proves that the people we overlook often possess the very strength and wisdom we need the most. Sometimes the deepest healing begins the moment we choose to truly see the person standing right in front of us. If this story of resilience, redemption, and the incredible power of human connection moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell for more real-life stories that will inspire and make you think. Thank you for watching.